when we had the, if you did the Iliad or the Odyssey, where there's the sense of it starts off relatively slowly and then it makes progress. And as the progress begins, the excitement builds because we've already been tipped off about how it's all going to resolve itself anyway. Odysseus is going to come home. It's been prophesied by the gods. And when he comes, he's going to avenge himself upon the suitors who've dishonored his house. We know that's going to happen. It's still a build-up for it, and the excitement builds as the story progresses, so that at first it's a little bit slow going, and as you build, you can start to, you can't put it down. Same with The Lord of the Rings. Works the same way, by the way. Which begins with this ridiculous concerning hobbits, which almost made me put it down and not pick it up. So 40 pages concerning hobbits, and I thought, is this book what it's cracked up to be? And okay, I'll give it a little bit more, and if it doesn't get better, I'm not going to read any further. It got better, yeah. I could not put it down. But for 40 pages, I was thinking that the author was insane. So there's exuberant, overflowing, rushing towards a resolution feature of it. So C.S. Lewis calls it, of the epic, this enormous onward pressure of the great stream on which you are embarked. It has a ritualistic quality, it has an incantatory quality, it has grandeur, there's exhilaration that comes with it. And you should read it all in one piece. So I realized that when you study the Bible, you tend to do it, well, let's do this chapter today, this chapter today. Read the whole of the book of Revelation as one. In fact, all biblical books should be read that way. It's going to take you a few hours. Okay. What else do you do in a few hours? A lot of silly things. Also, there are scenes that are like the councils of the gods in the Greco-Roman epics. There's the council of heaven, there's God the Father speaking, revealing things, what will come. There's a throne, there's a preview of history, future history, and there's a premise underlying that there will be a hero who is going to vanquish his enemies who are repugnant. Yes?
It strikes me about council of heaven in Revelation.
Yeah.
Compared to in the Greek epics. The gods in the Greek epics are always squabbling, regardless of what they are. They're always fighting with each other, even though Zeus is king, nobody really respects him as a king. But compared with the Revelation depiction, where everyone's glorifying him.
Sure.
Everyone's glorifying him.
Right. Because there are those heavenly beings that oppose him. They're called demons and Satan, and they are no longer in his presence. There might have been a sense that they were in his presence. We got that back in the book of Job. A sense that Satan's around the precincts of light somehow. Not anymore.
It's sort of again shows that this is the true king. This is the true master.
Yeah.
Like if Zeus was really the master, how do you let all these people that disrespect him do not treat him like the master?
Well, so those are in the Greek epics. You're talking about the Odyssey and the Iliad. If you look to other epics like by Hesiod, the account of Zeus overthrows his father, Saturn, and there are other gods. There's a theogony going on. So Zeus asserts a sort of a supremacy over the Olympian gods, but he himself has brought injustice in the world by executing his own father. And therefore the others are always rebelling against him. Well, that's the order of the cosmos in the Greeks. It's constant revolutionary attempt to overthrow those in authority. And there's an element of lawlessness about the way in which they got their authority, like Jupiter himself being the foremost example of that. Like a rebellious son and a regicide. He's killed the supreme. That's part of the character of the whole cosmos in the Greeks, whereas here you get no sense of injustice being any way associated with God. He is just and true and right, and there is no contradiction in that. There aren't two sides to the story in the sense that each has an argument to make. And there's some justice in their cause. There's a just side here and an unjust one. There's moral clarity on it, so thank you for that. That's correct. there are similarities and differences, but to say that it is an epic council, it has that, it's looking into the future about what's going to happen. And he speaks that, right? So that's a common feature, and similarly talks about the epic heroism of the primary character, who is Jesus, and what he will do and does do as the story progresses. And then finally, that he will conquer not just Satan, but sin and death and evil, and they will be utterly eradicated from the new heaven and the new earth. And an eternal spiritual kingdom will be established in its place. So it's not like the Odyssey, it's not like the Iliad. And I think you need to read it that way. Actually, the greatest works of literature, which are the Iliad and the Odyssey, by the way, the Iliad is such a great work of literature, need to be compared and contrasted with the biblical account and seen for how pale they are in comparison. And so Plato's objection to the Homeric worldview was just. He says that the gods must be just. They can't be these squabbling, thieving, lying, adulterous figures. They can't be that. That's not possible. So it's a philosophical objection to the ultimate powers of the world. It's almost a Christian objection.
They don't even act like adults.
No, they act like bad teenagers. The only thing they have, so they're the worst people you can imagine, except that they can't be killed. And they have greater power. So it's like modern comic book heroes, which we see on our screens now, just like them. That's an interesting comparison. Compare modern comic book fiction to the portrait of the gods in ancient Greece.
A lot of modern comic books
Are named after them.
they use
I know they do.
gods.
I know. So it's a return of what Augustine would call the doctrine of demons. Let's talk about symbolism in the book of Revelation, because the book of Revelation makes the unforgivable sin in literature, which is certainly not the unforgivable sin here, it mixes its metaphors. Never mix your metaphors, you're told. The book of Revelation does it. Jesus is portrayed as a lion and as a lamb. He hears a voice, John hears a voice behind him. The roar of a lion, he looks behind him, he sees a lamb looking as if it had been slain. That portrait of those two things that represent different aspects of God, which Lewis amplifies in his Narnia Chronicles again. And sometimes he does actually portray Aslan as a lamb, just one time. And one time, as Malcolm Guite observed in his lecture, as an albatross, which is really interesting. I'd forgotten about that. But just once. In general, he is the lion. But even in the Horse and His Boy, there's a discussion of the lion not being a real lion. He represents something more than a lion. It's right towards the end of A Horse and His Boy. Same thing here. So that these symbols symbolize something greater than themselves, but they represent something of that. The lion's the king of the beasts. The lamb is something that is sacrificed to propitiate an angry God, angry at sin. And it's the same figure. The angry God is also going to be the means of propitiation for his own anger. So these are symbolic, but these are also, and this is the challenging bit, they're also historic events. Now, they're never more historic or never more obviously historic than here in Revelation 12, which is the hermeneutic key to the whole of the book of Revelation. So there's a sense that these are future events, but there is a sense, and it is here in the book of Revelation chapter 12, that the incarnation of Christ is spoken of, and a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Might remind you a little bit of Joseph's vision. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains in the agony of giving birth, and then another sign appeared in heaven, and it's a succeeding sign. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. His mouth's right there. She gave birth to a male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Psalm 2. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. He calls these signs or portents. What do they? A sign designates something. It signifies something. What does it signify? So it's not a literal account. It's not to be taken literally, but it does refer to historical events. Plainly. I mean, whenever anyone reads this, they must spot the incarnation, the woman who's about to give birth, and who does she give birth to? The male child who's to rule all the nations, the one referred to in Psalm 2. From Jacob and his 12 sons. And then, so there's a lot of symbolism going on here as well. So it's a sign, not a literal account. The symbols of the tribes of Israel in verses 1 and 2 identify the woman as Israel. Who's the woman? Mary. So Mary is Israel in the symbolic representation. The child is obviously Christ. The dragon is Satan. If it weren't clear, it is clear in verse 9. The dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan. So if you didn't know who Satan was in Genesis 3, now you do. Abundantly clear. There. So although we're talking in symbolism, it's this hermeneutic key that allows Milton to write Paradise Lost. He sees it in those apocalyptic terms. That is where he gets it from. So it's an account of the events in Genesis 1 to 3. That's true, but the framework and the symbolic representations here of the dragon or the serpent and the third of the stars of heaven in verse 4 being swept down are talking about the battle in heaven that took place before the creation of the world. These are the fallen angels. He's getting this right from here, right? Paradise Lost is based on this account of Genesis. And the dragon is unable to destroy Christ during his earthly life and his redemptive ministry. So this is part of the symbolism that is going on here. And it doesn't literally describe the circumstances of Christ's birth. No mention of Bethlehem or anything of that sort. No Joseph, no manger, none of that. But it calls to those circumstances to mind to anybody who already knows the story. And you need that. By the way, don't start your evangelism with the book of Revelation. I don't think anyone ever has. But in case you were wondering, you don't. You have to know already those stories in order to make sense of this one. But so those circumstances are called to mind. And when that happens, of course, we also know that Mary is the woman whose seed will crush the head of the serpent, right? That's also there. So those stories are to be called to mind. That's how you can use symbolism. If there's already been a historical precedent of events that have passed on, then you can represent it symbolically. And I call to mind in one little picture all of those things. Now these then, this exegetical key is also there in the 4 horses in Revelation 6. The 4 horses. Is this correct? There's a white horse that goes out conquering, symbolizes the spirit of warfare. There's a red horse, color of blood. And by the way, each horse is worse than the next. Again, it's that general sense of all of the book of Revelation that things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And then it will be resolved, but there's a sense of doom and gloom. And the red letter, or the red horse, we're told is permitted to take peace from the earth. So not only is it warfare, there's no peace left. It's only warfare. The third horse is the black horse, the color of death. Its rider had a balance in his hand. Judgment. It's really odd for a warrior to carry a judgment. A voice explains, a quarter of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. These are the prices for the weights of gain, for the weights of grain in the picture of famine in Ezekiel 4. So this is, I'm getting this directly from Riken, because I never have known this. But this is quite brilliant. Ezekiel 9? I think it was, I said.
4.
I said 4.
Yeah.
9. Okay. Should listen to myself. You take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and emmer, and put them in a single vessel. Make your bread from them. During the number of days that you lie on your side, 390 days you shall eat it, and your food that you shall eat shall be by weight, 20 shekels a day. From day to day you shall eat it. This is the picture of famine, the food that is eaten in this. So this is a black horse. Famine follows the war. And it concludes with the 4th horse, which is yellow-green. And his name, the rider, is Death. And Hades follows after him. This is gruesome. What does it symbolize? These things. The Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Now, these 4 visions are symbolizing things that really will happen, but they don't happen literally as they're framed here. So there aren't going to be, we're waiting for that that red horse to ride out. When that red horse knows, then I'll know. The red horse symbolizes something. You're not going to see a red horse. Then you know, oh, there we go. So we won't see 4 riders, one being white, the other red, the third black, and the final yellow-green. Don't wait for those colored horses. I suspect the yellow-green is the sickness, disease that follows the famine. And this symbolism is there right from the outset. So in the letter to the 7 churches, won't bother going through here, but we see that the symbolism there. There's a sword coming out of Jesus' mouth. Have you seen the paintings that have a sword coming out of Jesus' mouth? Yeah. And people not having soiled their garments. Have you seen a picture of that? No, that one's not quite as good. Glorified believers becoming a pillar in a temple. Has anyone seen a portrait of that? I hope not. But they exist. If you look online, you'll find somebody like people standing there as a pillar. It's people who lack imagination. Christians having become lukewarm. Now try and picture that. You're not, like, really? Like, in your mouth and you spit them out. And then finally, Christ standing at the door and knocking. Nobody takes those literally. it's a symbolic. Everybody understands that. So the letter to the seven churches. Now this is the demonstration that symbolism pervades throughout the entirety of the book of Revelation, because even in the most historic sections, like the seven letters to the seven churches that existed in seven cities that we actually know about, and there are clear references to them, there's still symbolic language there. Even there, in the least or the most historic accounts, there's still symbolic language. Now this is all over the place. So what do the symbols mean? Well, as Rykins points out, and I would just do the most obvious thing. Don't try and get overly clever. Look to the obvious. When I say obvious, you have to have read your scripture to see. So you have to read, and this is about so I've said this all along. The way in which we see God is by hearing God. And by hearing God and understanding God and obeying God, then we see God. But we don't see God and then obey him. Remember, people saw Jesus and they didn't obey him. But when they no longer saw him, they then did, because his words stayed with them. So hearing precedes believing and seeing. So you have to have read the foregoing passages in Scripture to understand what you're seeing in the book of Revelation. So when I say it's obvious, it's only obvious if you've already read and understood. Otherwise, the revelation is not going to be doing anything other than confusing you. It doesn't stand on its own. You can't begin with the book of Revelation. Yes?
So then Eugene Peterson has been right all along when he contends it takes all of the Bible to understand all of the Bible?
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, of course it does. Of course he's right. Yeah, and he's also right in citing, although I don't know if he's saying this explicitly, that Scripture interprets Scripture. It's a revelation. It's a Reformation principle. Scripture provides the means by which we understand what Scripture means. So again, when we get the pictures of the sun, the moon, the stars bowing down to Joseph, we hear those in Revelation 12. We get those same images. Oh yeah, I remember that. What was the context for that? That's also brought to mind. So you have to have a strong sense of what happened in its original use, and then that is picked up in your mind and applied here in the vision. So the 360 references to the Old Testament will only be apparent to you if you know the Old Testament well enough to pick them up, which obviously the writer John did know that well. So these symbols are spiritual realities, and they need to be understood they're quite obvious, and they're using conventional and universal language. That's what symbols do, by the way. So it's conventional language and associations. They're meant to reveal, not to conceal. So if you don't know what the symbol means, then that's because you haven't read enough of the scriptures before it. Calvin, the great interpreter that he was, didn't feel that he was up to it, which I find humbling, particularly since I'm talking about it right now. But remember, it is the apocalypse. The symbols are there not to conceal things; they're to reveal things, and what they reveal is something that ought to be obvious to us upon the reading of what has gone on before. And biblical symbolism has been used throughout Scripture, and they're symbolic pictures. So it doesn't describe things literally, but it does take literal things and bring them to mind, just in a picture, and then you move on. Time here. This is an important comment. The visual nature could be misunderstood. When I say that it's visual, which it plainly is, the colors and the characters and the scenes, all of which were, starkly opposed to one another. Those are visual, but they're not pictorial. You're not supposed to see a picture. You're not supposed to paint a picture. You can't draw a picture of the book of Revelation, because it's visual, but it's not pictorial. Don't think in terms of a picture, but do think in terms of an image. and this is the writing, this is how one scholar puts it, who Ryken quotes, symbolic writing does not paint pictures, it is not pictographic, but ideographic. It visualizes an idea. Ideographic, not pictographic. The skull and crossbones on the bottle of medicine is a symbol of poison, but not a picture of poison. The fish, the lamb, the lion are all symbols of Christ, but never to be taken as pictures of him. They're symbols of Christ. Do you think Christ looks like the fish on the back of your car? No. Nor the cross, for that matter, but it's a symbol. Sure, it reminds us of something. In the fish, I think, what the heck? Well, it's ichthus, right? So the letters of his name. So it's a clever way. It's got nothing to do with fish. So the symbol is a code word. It doesn't paint a picture that we're supposed to see as a picture, but it does visually represent an idea that you already understood from the foregoing historical understanding. So when we get back in Revelation 12, once again, this picture of this woman who is clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. It does remind us of Joseph's vision, but we're not really supposed to see a woman like this. We're supposed to get the ideas of what that is associated with. Deliverance, famine. Think of the context here of death and so forth. She's going to deliver us from all of those terrible blights. She's a symbol of the church, furthermore. But she's not a picture of the church. Let me move on. The portrait of Christ is described in similar terms. He has eyes like a flame of fire, feet like burnished bronze. These are the transcendent aspects of Christ. The holy is often described in these terms in the Old Testament. There's also the book of enameled imagery. So there are jewels and glass, which make us think about the hardness of the stone, but also the brilliance and the light and how it's cast about. So there's a spiritual realm that fits the hardness of the physical realm, and yet there's a lightness to it that exceeds the physical realm. And the physical realm reminds us of that spiritual realm, and that's because they are closely allied. Christ has 7 stars in his right hand. He has a 2-edged sword coming out of his mouth. He's got a face shining like the sun in its full strength. These are, again, visual pictures symbolizing aspects and ideas that relate to Christ, not to be seen as he has don't paint a picture of a sword coming out of his mouth. Or you misunderstood the visual imagery. It's an idea, not a picture. Finally, there are lots of archetypes. Those are all over the place. So, and the last half of the book is familiar. There's a woman in distress, marvelously delivered in Revelation 12 here. There's a hero on a white horse who kills a dragon. There's a wicked prostitute who's exposed for her harlotries. There's a marriage of the triumphant hero to his bride. There's a celebration of the wedding with a feast. There is a description of a palace that's glittering with jewels until the hero comes, and then he lives with the bride there, and they live all happily ever after. Right? Those are all there. So there's a journey to that. And there's a rescue, there's a quest motif. The outline of the book of Revelation follows along the guidelines of the Olivet Discourse that I said earlier. It follows that roughly. I'm just using that rather than going through that. If you're interested in the outline, Ryken has it on 489 and 490. But let's conclude with talk about the conclusion, if I can get to that. Where are my notes there? I have mixed them up. The final chapters in the book of Revelation are just like the first chapters in all of the Bible. The anti-penultimate chapter, the third last chapter, is like Genesis 3, in which the dragon departs. So the serpent's there in the third chapter, the serpent's there in the third last chapter. But in the third last chapter, he is thrown into the abyss. That's the end of him. And then we get Genesis 1 and 2 recapitulated in the last two chapters. Following, of course, as I said at the end, there's the epistolary features of it. But these last two chapters draw the whole book to a climax. Not just the book of Revelation, but the whole Bible. So what sort of resolution are we going to see here? Well, there's strong closure. There's a sense of a conclusion to it. But on the other hand, and this reflects the temporal and eternal motif that had been going on throughout the book of Revelation, since the heavenly forces are eternal, this ending will be a new beginning for those who are belonging to the bride and to the Lamb. So there's a strong sense of conclusion. There's also a strong sense of a new beginning. So it's reminiscent of Genesis 1 and 2. There's a new beginning. There's a new heaven and there's a new earth. There's also a reminder and an echo of the beginning. But note the description here. He saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I've talked about this repeatedly. God has not decided that water was a bad thing. Sea was the representation of evil by this point. Symbolically, there's no more symbolic sea. I suspect that there's water in the new heaven and the new earth, and even what we would call seas, but there's no longer something that symbolizes evil, and this is a symbol of evil by this point. Second aspect of the conclusion, there's an echo of the beginning. It reminds us a little bit of it. Where did the story of Genesis and the whole Bible began? It's really important. These two frames at the beginning of Scripture and at the end of Scripture are like the whole account of all of human history and everything that falls within it. God talks about creating everything in Genesis 1. Here it is again. Now there's a difference, however, and I'm going to come to the difference as well, because there's a sense of progress in this all as well. And Revelation 22, what do we see in the garden? The river of life. The river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life. Remember, they were sent out of the Garden of Eden so they could not eat of the tree of life and be cursed forever, have eternal death, because they had sin in them, and they would have had to live. Terrible blight that would have been. And the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit yielding its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it. So there's a sense of a return to the beginning, because we're back in the garden. And the garden is in the midst of a city now, so here's the sense of progress. This first city came after they were thrown into the Garden of Eden. It was built by who? Cain. He built the first city. That was a place that opposed God. This new city is a place that God himself inhabits. And the gates of it are open. There's no more war. You don't need gates to bar it. There's free access. There's light in the midst of it. So it's the perfect image of the corporate and the individual. There's the bride and there's the city. There's the city, and the city now represents not hostility to God, but a place where God's dominion has been expressed culturally in a civilization in which humanity is blessed, in which God is honored, and which God's glory will never end. Now that's not in the beginning, so there's no sense of a city in the book of Genesis or Genesis 1, but there is the cultural mandate to build and cultivate and exercise dominion. The city is a symbol of dominion, but now it's a God-honoring dominion as opposed to the earthly cities where it's a man-honoring dominion, it's a beast-honoring dominion. So there's a beginning, there's an ending, and there's a new beginning, and the new beginning is far better than the early beginning, because now God is with man. He's right with them, just like he was in the garden. So that's how it ends, and that is the end of the course.